Day 2 of the Cairns Cup saw another round of exciting action with 2 decisive games as the tournament starts to heat up. Once again, folks, this is a 10-player round robin, one of the strongest female super tournaments of the year, being hosted right here in St. Louis. Jumping into today's results of round 2, Harika Dronavalli managed to defeat one of yesterday's leaders in Alexandra Kosteniuk, leapfrogging her in the standings. Also winning was Nana Dzagnidze, who beat last year's champion Anna Zatonskih. Meanwhile, we had draws between the Muzychuk sisters, as well as in the games between Zhongyi versus Irina Krush and Elisabeth Paehtz against Alice Lee. So after 2 rounds, we've got Dzagnidze, Harika, Mariya Muzychuk, and Zhongyi in the early lead with 1.5 out of 2. Jumping into today's games, we'll start between the battle of the Muzychuk sisters, and it's well known, of course, the sisters, they don't like to play each other, so this game was actually not very long. It was an advanced Caro-Kann with an early c5, and the position was rather sharp here after b4, bishop to d3, knight to g6, both players playing relatively quickly, f5 en passant, and now e5, very important move for black to get some counterplay in the center. This ended up being quite a sharp position. Queen h5, rook e4, knight g5, bishop takes f2 check. Now king to e1. If king takes f2, then black can take on f6 with a check, first with the rook followed by the queen. So instead we saw king to d1 here, and now after rook takes f6, if white takes this one, white is actually going to be in trouble after queen takes f6. Sorry for my bad arrow there. Instead, we got queen takes h7 check, king f8, queen back to h5, and here the 2 players repeated king g8, queen h7 check, and a draw here was soon agreed. So yeah, this often happens between the 2 sisters. It's well known. They really don't like playing against each other, but yeah, good thing we got that one out of the way in round 2. Moving on to the next game between Harika Dronavalli against Alexandra Kosteniuk. Here Harika starts with knight f3, d5, and plays e3. This opening is known as the e3 poison system, where white plays for an early c4 and often fianchettos the bishop on b2. Here after knight f6, c4, c5, we got takes, knight c3, knight c6, bishop to b5. And here, after some thought, Kosteniuk plays knight b4, which is probably not a very good move. Already after d4 in this position, I think white would be doing well. Instead, Harika chose the move a3, which is interesting. After check, king to e2, here black really needed to play the move bishop to f5. This was quite important in order to induce the move e4. And then black could play either knight to f4 check or take on c1 and would have a very reasonable position. White's king on e2 looks a little bit funny, but white can castle by hand here and should be fine as well. Instead, we got knight takes c1 right away, and after rook takes c1, this position actually is quite good for white. White is ahead in development, and d4 is coming very quickly with pressure against the knight on c6. So bishop d7, d4, cd, Harika throws in bishop takes c6, and now bishop takes, probably a mistake. So after knight takes d4, this position ends up being very, very nice for white. Black can't really get away with taking on g2 here. White has a lot of ideas like queen a4 check, for example. I think knight cb5 is even stronger, and there's problems on the c file here for black. So instead, black needed to go bc, and then after queen takes d4, white has a nice position here. Definitely an advantage, but it's not quite decisive yet. Instead, after takes, knight takes d4, queen to b6. Harika just trades on c6 here. Black takes with the pawn, queen a4, and this position is just very, very nice for white. Huge advantage because white has already connected the rooks. The king on e2 is perfectly safe, and it's actually black that is behind in development here. And yeah, knight e4, and white is already ready to clamp down on the c file as well as go after the c pawn. So rook c8, knight d2, there's a bit of maneuvering here. But eventually Harika goes for the endgame, knight to e5, and here black is likely just losing a pawn because, again, just way behind in development. Bishop d6, takes on c6, and brings the knight back. And from here, Harika's technique was very, very good. At this point, she's a pawn up, and black essentially has no counterplay, just has to kind of sit and wait for white to improve their position, which of course white does here with g5, takes, bishop g3, king comes in, check, and now knight to e5. Black doesn't want to take the knight, but kind of has to, and now after king takes, white just has a very, very nice rook endgame, which Harika does eventually convert. It takes some time here, but her technique is quite smooth, just keeping everything under control. And here it's really all about the kings. Even though black's rook is able to get active and pick up a couple pawns, white's king is just way too strong in this position. And yeah, as I said, the technique was quite smooth. Rook f7 here, king f5, and white's 2 pawns decide the day. There was a couple more moves here, h3, check, e7, h2, white brings the rook around. Now black is not in time to promote because white will just take and make a new queen. Instead we saw check and rook e7, but now takes, king f6. Here black resigned as white's g-pawn is going to cost black the rook here, and of course that is a trivially won endgame. So big win for Harika. She defeats one of the previous leaders in Kosteniuk, and she manages herself to jump into a tie for first place. Also getting into a tie for first was Nana Dzagnidze, who ends up winning quite a nice game here against Anna Zatonskih. Dzagnidze also chooses a similar setup to Harika with this early like e3, b3 setup. And this one is actually quite even for a while. Black was doing totally fine out of the opening. I don't think white had anything special here, but she does manage to get a bit of pressure against black's center. However, this game was more or less decided by a blunder by Zatonskih. I'll take you folks to the critical moment here. After the exchange on b5, knight f5, queen c7, rook c1, queen b8, rook to b1. Here, Zatonskih blunders with the move bishop to f8. She needed to play rook to c5, and afterwards, black is doing quite okay there. Instead, after bishop to f8, Dzagnidze found bishop takes e5. Nice tactic, utilizing the fact that black's rook on the b file is hanging, and black can't take the bishop on e5. They'd be losing the exchange. If black takes the rook on b1, well, then the queen hangs on b8. So queen b6 is played, rook takes b5, but here white has managed to pick up a very, very healthy extra pawn and can now take on f6 if she wants to. Instead, she goes for knight h6 check, also very, very good. If the king moves, then f7 is falling, so black took on h6 here, but now bishop takes f6. White is a pawn up, and black's kingside structure is ruined. And the technique definitely took some time here, but once again, white was winning all the way through. Very, very difficult position for black to hold, being down a pawn and with the king safety problems. So Zatonskih tries d4 and queen d5, just looking to trade off some pawns, but it's really not enough. Queen c5, check, and d5. White handles this one very, very well. Rook to c3, now looking to generate a mating attack against the king. Black does take here, but check, queen h8, rook e3, and now queen takes h7. White is still a pawn up. Black's remaining pawns are very, very weak here. And of course, the king is still weak on d7. And we actually do get an endgame in this one after check and queen to g6. Probably the best try here from black. Unfortunately, the endgame is immediately lost. Black's king is cut off, but that's not the real issue. The real issue is that white can play rook d3 check and just immediately trade off the rooks. And in fact, this might have been the only way to actually win the game. After rook to d3, white trades on d8 and gets classic king and pawn endgame here with 3 pawns versus 2. Sometimes these can be drawn, but in most cases they are winning. This was not an exception. White just slowly advances the pawns, and eventually the king is able to get in. In case of king to d6 here, for example, white can advance f5 and is winning that endgame. So king f6, king d5, king f7, white's king gets in here, g5, f5. There was a bit of dancing around here with black not wanting to take this pawn, but in any case, it was winning for white. The final breakthrough promotion, the king now gets in, and black's king is not able to keep white's king out. King to g6 was the final move, as now white is winning the second pawn, and the rest, of course, is very simple. So big win for Dzagnidze, who also jumps into the tie for first place. Then we had 2 more draws to finish off the round. The first one here between Zhongyi against Irina Krush. This one was a Sicilian that soon became an open Sicilian. And this was quite an interesting game. We got the exchange on c6, rook e1, 97, queen h5, quite aggressive from white here early on, and now a4. But actually black was doing totally fine in this position, and it seemed like Krush actually solves all of her problems quite well here. Bishop to d6, the bishop comes to e5, and at this point actually I think black is already doing quite fine. White could take twice on a6 here, but then queen a5 would come at the end of that line, and yeah, black has everything under control. So knight e2 played, castles, f4. This turns out to be a surprising mistake. Queen to b6 check from black, and now Krush finds a very strong move, queen f2, just hitting the rook on e1 and the pawn on f4. So if the rook moves away, black can take on f4 and win a pawn. Bishop d2 was white's choice instead, which is probably better, but now bishop takes b2 and black is able to snag this pawn. So at this point, actually, black has a very clear advantage here. Rook to f1, queen h4 was played. I think queen a7 was preferred by the engines, just keeping the queens on the board. But of course, being a pawn up, it makes sense to try and trade the queens off. White looks to avoid the trade, queen to e7, queen f2, and now f5. Black very much in control here, but soon Irina goes wrong with this move, queen a3, likely overlooking white's shot here, knight takes f5, which does kind of turn the game into a much more complicated situation, as white is hitting this knight on h4. So we got ef, queen h4, takes on e4, trades, more trades on e4, queen to c5. Now the position is simplifying, and black is still doing well here, an extra pawn and really good pieces, but it's no longer it's definitely never easy to convert, but here it really becomes difficult for black to get the full point. Rook f6, rook e7, bishop to d4, maybe king h7 was a better try at this point, just getting the king a little bit safer here. After bishop d4, white finds rook c1 and bishop to c3, and now Tan essentially saves the game by being able to trade off these bishops. Without the bishops on the board, white has a much easier time creating counterplay against black's king. We had some complications here, takes, rook e8 check, rook f8 is played, takes, and now bishop takes g7, getting the pawn back, king takes g7, and now queen takes c1. Players ended up in this queen and pawn endgame with equal pawns, and this is very drawish, as either side can likely set up a perpetual check if they need to. So black pushed the pawn, and now white comes in and just immediately gave a perpetual check. There's not really much white can play for here. Black's d-pawn is way too strong anyway, and draw was agreed. Finally, we had the game between Paehtz and Alice Lee, and this was quite an exciting game as well. Starts off with kind of a ready system from white with a Grunfeld approach from black. c4 takes on c4, queen a4, white gets back the pawn, and I would say white was definitely doing well here out of the opening. In fact, Alice quickly goes wrong in this position. Instead of the move knight d7, she goes for rook e8, allowing white to take this pawn, and after bishop f8, queen a5, it seems like white is actually able to get away with this. c6, knight f3, and white is just pawn up. So definitely something went wrong for Alice there in the calculation, as she did have this move knight d7 to just bring the knight back and keep this one defended. But now Paehtz goes up a pawn, starts pushing e4, and has a big advantage here. Trades on c5, bishop to g5, bishop f4, and knight d5. Perhaps this wasn't the best way to convert the advantage. I think h3 here was quite simple, just going after the bishop here. Perhaps this was a better choice for white. Nevertheless, Paehtz definitely keeps a lot of winning chances throughout this game, but things do get very messy quite soon. So queen e1, bishop f7, now e5. Again, maybe b3 here would have been better, stopping black from playing knight c4, as happens in the game. And at this point, Alice has basically fought her way back into it. b3, black wins back the pawn, although white definitely keeps some advantage here, as black's structure is weaker. Black has a couple more weaknesses than white does in this position. So at this point, black is actually closer to equality, but white definitely continues to play for the win, h4. And it's really not that easy of a position for black to defend, as white has a very simple plan of pushing h5 and eventually getting this pawn to h6. And this soon does happen. White gets h5 and can play h6 next. At this point, white is doing quite well again. Rook c6, rook to c1, and h6 here. Fantastic position for white. She now takes the 7th rank with rook c7, takes here. Queen takes h6. Black is able to pick up this h6 pawn, but now the king on f8 is actually very, very weak. So bishop f3, queen f6, and at this point, Paehtz commits a very serious blunder, rook to e1. She needed to play the move rook to c7 here to keep her huge advantage. Very, very active move, just bringing the 7th rook to the second rook to the 7th rank. And from here, things are very, very dangerous for Black's king. Instead, we saw the move rook to e1, and now Alice pounces on her chance with the move rook to d3, the very unfortunate skewer against white's queen and bishop on f3. Players are in time trouble here, and it looks like black might be winning, but Paehtz does find her best chance to save the game with rook takes f7 check, sacrificing the exchange. Now the point is, if king takes f7, white would have bishop h5 check to save the bishop. And then after king to g7, white could at least play this position down the exchange. Queen takes e5 might be the best move. And black has very decent winning chances here, but of course, the win would be far from easy. Instead, Alice played the move queen takes f7, which looks stronger because black keeps the attack on the queen and bishop, and there's no bishop h5 check. But white can take on g5, and after queen takes f3, black is a rook up, but white has queen takes e5, and surprisingly, black has no defense to the threat of queen h8 check with a perpetual. So king to g8, for example, white can go queen to g5 check, and anywhere that black's king goes, white can go back to e5 and force a repetition. Of course, black can also get themselves mated here if they're not careful with king f7, rook e7 check. But basically, best case scenario here for either side. Best case scenario is a draw as long as white plays optimally. So in this position with no time, Alice played queen f7. Rook d1 would have been the same story, queen h8, and white has the perpetual. So queen f7, and Paehtz, of course, immediately grabs the perpetual after having blundered the piece, and the game was indeed ended here in a draw. So very, very exciting game. At first winning for white, then possibly winning for black, ending in this perpetual. And yeah, I think both players a little bit disappointed with the result in the end. So that brings us into tomorrow's round 3, where we'll have a number of interesting matchups once again. We've got Mariya Muzychuk white against Tan Zhongyi, Alice Lee white against Harika, Anna Zatonskih white against Anna Muzychuk, Kosteniuk white against Dzagnidze, and Krush white against Paehtz. Should be another very exciting round, and hopefully you folks will tune in for the recap. Until next time, take care.